good? Okay. So as a reminder from last week, we said that God has great mercy and compassion for those he has created, but we're still expected to obey his commands. And that really came out of our talk on Judges. And there's a specific cycle that we talked about that occurs in the book of Judges. Do you guys remember what that cycle was? I'm really looking here at Riley, Maddie, and Reagan, who weren't here last week. So. Okay, so the cycle in Judges basically works like this. You see Israel fall into a ridiculous amount of sin. They're completely disobeying everything that God says. And then they go from there, and God says, okay, well, as a consequence of your sin, I'm going to let you fall into the hands of your enemies. And so he lets them be punished. And then Israel eventually decides, hey, this is a really bad thing. We don't like this very much. God, please rescue us. And so they call out and they confess, God, save us. And then what do you think God does? Saves them. Saves them, that's right. And he saves them through a very particular means. Who does he use?
Judges.
Judges! Yeah, good job, Kobe. All right. Yeah, he uses judges, okay? And he brings about different people throughout each cycle to bring about relief for the people. And so you have a lot of different people show up. But towards the end of the book, I mean, things are just getting worse and worse. The judges aren't doing a good job at being judges. I mean, it's just really all going downhill fast. So we really ended last week on this note where the end of Judges really keeps repeating this key phrase of, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And so that's kind of leading us into the kingdom literature of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And so we get into 1st Samuel here, and Samuel is now the leader of the people. And the elders of Israel say to him, you are old and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us such as all the other nations have. So what's Israel's original reason that they're stating here as why they want a king?
They need someone to follow.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of in there because they talk about to lead us.
Because they don't have a king, so they need someone to lead them so that they can know what to do.
Yeah, and I mean, you definitely see some of the reasoning here in this second part of the statement here, but really it's the main reason is right in this first part.
You're old.
He's old. But there you go. His sons don't follow his ways. Okay? So they bring that up first as if that's the reason that they want a king. Because they're arguing that Samuel's sons aren't following his ways, and therefore they won't be able to lead Israel the same way that Samuel has. And so they're saying, we want a king to lead us when you die instead of your sons, so that we can still have somebody to lead over us. And so they're making it come across as if this is something that is a good reason for them to want. And so that's the reason that they present to begin with. So Samuel gets this request, and he's really irritated about it. He's really broken up, and so he actually goes to God, praying about it and saying, this is a bad idea. I know that this is a bad idea. And God basically responds, yeah, it is a bad idea. But they're asking for it, so give them what they want. And so Samuel goes back to the people and he says, look, you guys can have a king, but here's the thing. Here's what a king's going to do. And if you actually go back to this passage in Samuel 8 during the week and you review Samuel 8 and the verses that follow this, where Samuel specifically tells the people what's going to be involved with a king, it's not good. And the funny thing is that it's exactly what we are going to end up seeing when we get to First and Second Kings, because he talks about how the kings are going to eventually call up on their sons and their husbands, and they're going to say, "You're going to come serve as my chariots. You're gonna run my chariots for me. You're going to till my ground for me. You're going to go into battle for me." You know, there's all these different things that they're going to do, and the king is going to demand all of this of the people. And he says, "You don't want that. That's not good." And the people still come back, and they say, and they refuse him, and they say, "No, we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." And so, when they first approached Samuel, they said that the reason that they wanted a king was what? What?
Because
Yeah, Samuel's sons, exactly. Okay? And so when they first approach Samuel, they say, because of your sons, we want a king to rule over us because they're not going to do a good job. What's the reasoning here? Say what? Yes. They want to be like the other nations around them. How do you think that's going to end? Bad. Because what has Israel been called to be? I mean, from the beginning, when God calls Abraham, he specifically says he wants Abraham to be a blessing to the other nations. So are they supposed to be like the other nations?
No.
No. God specifically gives out the commands in Exodus and Leviticus and repeats them in Deuteronomy for them so that they can understand. He wants them to be a different kind of people. He wants them to understand that when people come up to them, they aren't supposed to graze all the way to the edges of their field so that people can, harvest that if they need it. He wants to make sure that his people are taken care of and that they are taking care of other people as well. Because God specifically tells them, because you were foreigners once, because you were slaves once, I want you to make sure that if somebody comes into your country, if somebody comes into Israel wanting help, wanting support, wanting relief, that you're to give it to them. Because you were slaves too. Because you were foreigners too. And so God specifically calls on Israel to be a kingdom unlike any other kingdom in the world, and Israel's completely backtracking on that and saying, no, we want to be like the other nations. And it's really funny because as this continues, whenever Saul is ended up placed as king, they come back and they go through this process, and Samuel reads through the entire thing, and then he says, all right, now I'm going to have God call down thunder and rain to show you just what an evil thing it is that you've done. And God does. He creates this huge storm, and the Israelites realize, oh, this was a bad idea. And they confess, and they say, this was a bad idea. We've done a terrible, terrible thing by asking for a king. Please pray for us. And Samuel ends up coming back and saying, I will pray for you. I won't stop praying for you. And God is going to work this out for the good. Okay? So, this theme right here of like the other nations is really going to become the theme that runs through a lot of the stories. So when we start to interact with Saul, the first thing that we hear of him in chapter 9 is that his father was a man of standing. Okay? Now if you go to some other translations, what it'll say is that his father was a wealthy man. So they both mean the same thing. I actually prefer the wealthy translation just because it's a little bit easier to understand that his father had a lot of money, and that makes a bigger point here in just a second because Saul is introduced to us because his father's donkeys get lost. And so Saul starts to search for the donkeys. And as Saul goes about the process, he eventually just decides he's ready to give up. And then his servant says, okay, well, there's a, Samuel's here, and we can go visit with him, and he can tell us where the donkeys are. And Saul comes back and says, well, we don't have anything to give to Samuel, so what are we going to do? What are we going to give him? And this is what the servant comes back and says. Look, I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God so that he will tell us what way to take. You guys see a problem between what's happening here?
Just not real.
Okay.
Is it kind of like he wants something to give somebody something else? Like they're gonna give it to him just to know the answer. I just hope it's something.
I mean, that probably wasn't the best way to approach Samuel and the prophets and such, but apparently it was expected that when you visited with the prophet or the seer, as they say in the text here in chapter 9, I guess it was kind of this cultural expectation that if you visited the prophet, you were expected to bring a gift. So I don't know. I mean, there might have been an issue with that, but I don't know. It seems like it might have been a cultural thing. Is Daddy poor? No. Who's the one paying?
Daddy.
Is he?
Yes.
What does verse 8 say? Who's the one paying?
The servant.
The servant. You're starting to catch on? What's the problem?
Dad's rich, but the servant's still poor.
Yeah. Saul specifically has a wealthy father, and either he's got the money in his pocket and just doesn't want to spend it, and he's perfectly fine with his servant spending it, or he didn't bother bringing it on the trip with him while he's searching for donkeys, where I imagine money would come in handy. Monkeys would not come in handy whatsoever. And he just allows his servant to use his own money to retrieve the donkeys that were lost. Okay? And so the first thing that we see with Saul is that he abuses people. Hey, David. So yeah, the first thing that we see with Saul is that he abuses people. He takes advantage of people. And so not only do we see the first characteristic of Saul, but we also see that he's like all the other nations, a king like all the other nations. He's not caring of his people. He uses them and he abuses them. So the next thing we see. As they're going through this process, before they actually get to this point where they discuss going to see Samuel, Saul just kind of gives up and he says, "Come, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start worrying about us." What's the problem here? Did they find the donkeys? Nope. What's Saul doing? Is he going to keep looking? No. So he's
Done.
giving up. He's done. Yeah. Okay? So now, keep that in mind and think about David. David specifically confronts Goliath, and before he goes out there, he's talking to Saul, and he's talking to the others, and he mentions about how he's a shepherd, right? And he says that if he lost his sheep, what did he do? He went to find it. If he found it with a lion or a bear, what did he do? Yeah, he fought a stupid lion or a bear. I mean, he's not joking. And so David has this natural tendency of, man, if something's lost, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to go after it. I'm going to get it. Saul says, whatever. Even though he's technically responsible for it, he's not taking responsibility for it. Saul doesn't care about what he's responsible for. And so, again, we see a clue into Saul's character, but more importantly, we see that he's a king like all the other nations. He doesn't give a rip. It's his own property, and he doesn't care. And we clearly saw that that reflects into how he treats his servant. Because his servant is offering to use up his own property, and he doesn't care. Servant replied, "Look, in this town is a man of God." And so Saul's ready to give up, and the servant replies, "Look, there's a man of God here." Should Saul know where the man of God is? Probably. I mean, if the servant knows where the man of God is, if Saul had a heart after God, you would think that Saul would know and pay attention to where Samuel is going to be, especially if there's this idea that Samuel is going to be able to give them an answer as to where the donkeys are. You would think he would pay attention to where a man like Samuel is going to be. And so we see that Saul isn't a faithful man. And once again, we see that he's a king like all the other nations. He really doesn't care. He's concerned about himself, and that's about it. Okay, so for our reading for today, we're going to go into 1 Samuel chapter 15. Does anybody need a Bible?
I do.
Okay. Anybody else? Did you?
Actually, yeah,
Anybody else? Are we good? Alright. Let's see here. And I can't remember, did we start on this side or that side last week? Okay, so we'll start with Reagan. Okay. So, 1 Samuel 15. Let's do 2 verses each, okay?
Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over the people of Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the
Amalekites.
Amalekites
Yep.
for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt.
I will attack the Amalekites until they destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infant, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 for soldiers and 10,000 for Judah.
Saul went to the city of Amalekite
Yep.
and set an ambush in a ravine. Then he said to the Canaanites, "Go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt." So the Canaanites moved away from the Amalekites.
Then Saul attacked the Amalekites, and the way from
Havilah.
Havilah to Shur,
Mm-hmm.
near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and his people he totally destroyed with the sword.
But Saul now spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed.
Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel.
I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord that night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal.
When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instruction." But Samuel said, "What then is the bleating of the sheep and goats? What is the lowing of cattle that I hear?"
Saul answered, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." "Enough," Samuel said to Saul. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." Tell me," Saul replied.
Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out.'"
Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. I brought back Agag, their king.
The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder. The best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the sacrifice."
For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave it to you.
Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind." Saul replied, "I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites." Agag came to him confidently, thinking, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women." And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. All right. So, just like we usually do, is there anything that caught your attention? Oh, wow. Okay. Anything that caught your attention in 1 Samuel 15?
It's kind of hard to kill the children and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that's one thing that comes up quite a bit. What verse is that in? Well, I'll just put it up here since we're destroy them all. And, it's a hard command for us to hear in our culture today, and I mean, it's still something that's regrettable. It's something though that it's important to understand that the history of what's going on that's happened with the Amalekites, and God kind of references it there at the beginning of the chapter where he says how Israel was on their way to the promised land. They weren't in any way interfering with the Amalekite territory, and the Amalekites just decided to come down and raid and try and attack Israel. And so what's happening here in chapter 15 is God punishing the Amalekites. And in fact, God does tell Israel throughout the book of Joshua and such, and they're supposed to do it throughout Judges too, but they don't, is this process of taking out all the inhabitants of the land. And it once again gets back to what we've talked about before of God has tried to show grace to these kingdoms time and time again, and they chose rebellion instead. We see it with Rahab, where she decided on her own to turn her family over to God. We see it with the Gibeonites. They take a different route, but they still want to follow God. We see it with a lot of different people in the New Testament too. But the Amalekites are a people that God particularly orders to be destroyed. And the funny thing is that they come back up in the story of Esther, because Haman is called an Agagite. And the king that they just killed, his name was Agag. And so the feud that happens in the book of Esther is directly related to what happens right here. And so there's a reason that God specifically calls for this to happen. It's still something sad. Anytime that people have to die, it's a sad thing. But it's one of those things that we have to understand the context of what's going on. Anything else that you guys thought? Okay. So there's if we have a second, then we'll jump back to a few of these things. But for now, since we've already had one bell, excuse me, let's go ahead and do this. The main part that I want us to focus on is this right here, in verses 22 through 23. Samuel tells him, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams." And so this is a really key point in the whole message of the Bible, is that obedience, sacrifice is something that God obviously expected during the Old Testament, but obedience was something that God was really looking for. And it comes back up in the New Testament, because the Pharisees are guilty of the same thing. They would sit there and give of their spices and everything, but they weren't actually giving of their hearts. They weren't actually obeying what God wanted them to. And so, and it's interesting too, because he specifically says, rebellion is like the sin of divination. What does Saul do at the end of the book before he dies? Consults the medium. He goes for divination. Kind of funny how that works out. And so God seeks out people who will obey him with all their heart. And the message for this morning that I want you guys to take away is, we can act like followers all we want. We can talk the church talk. We can talk, we can, wear the Jesus clothes and everything else. But we have to obey God's commands to be truly pleasing to him. It's pure and simple. If we sit here and talk all this, but then, behind our backs we're talking bad about other people, we're maliciously spreading gossip about other people, we're not pleasing to God. If we're doing all this other stuff, but we're not taking care of the poor and the hungry and those that are in need, that's not pleasing. And it's not to say that the point is that if your heart is chasing after God, that's the part to remember, because you're always going to have something that you need to work on. But if your heart isn't actually there, if you're only putting forward the look of it without actually having your heart changed, that's the part that God's concerned about. So if you're going to encounter with us, we need to leave the building by noon if we can, because we have to remember that they're an hour ahead of us. Registration starts at 2 their time, and then dinner starts at 5. So we need to try and leave by noon. For those of you guys that are staying, there's going to be an ice cream social tonight. So bring carton of ice cream for tonight. Wednesday night, there won't be youth class, so just go ahead and stay in the fellowship hall with the adults. So, love you guys. Think you're awesome. We'll wait for the morning.